Hello and welcome. Thank you very much for joining me today for another presentation as part of the GreyLearning Webinar series. Today, a bit of a long title, and that would be Accessing Photos from Anywhere with Adobe Lightroom Classic, which is a topic that I know creates a little bit of confusion. We're going to talk about that confusion directly, of course, so that you'll get a better sense of the context around all of this, because you'll notice that I specifically emphasized that Lightroom Classic is the focus here. And so this is assuming that you're using Lightroom Classic or that you intend to get started at some point with Lightroom Classic to manage your overall photo workflow, to organize and optimize and share your photos. And of course, then wanting to take advantage of some of the other really great features that are available that I find many photographers are not aware of. And so we'll talk about some of those points of confusion, essentially, and then I'll guide you through a couple of workflow scenarios, essentially, to show you some of the ways that you might want to access some of your photos when you are away from your Lightroom Classic catalog. So as you'll see, that might, of course, involve using a different computer altogether or using a smartphone or a tablet, for example. I imagine most of you are aware when you signed up for this webinar presentation that you knew it was me, Tim Gray, who's going to be doing the presenting. And so I know many of you are aware that typically I'm doing a lot of travel. Usually I would say that a good more than half the year. This year I was actually scheduled to be traveling something like 10 months out of the year, 9 or 10 months out of the year. That has obviously dramatically changed, but typically I'm using Lightroom whenever I'm traveling. And for me personally, I know many of you are aware that I'm using a laptop. I've talked about this in a variety of presentations where I'm using a laptop as my primary computer. That's been the case for, oh my goodness, more than 10 years now. And so when I'm traveling, I actually have my laptop, and yet it is still advantageous to be able to make use of some of the other capabilities going beyond just Lightroom Classic on the computer, as it were. So thanks again for joining me. Welcome to this presentation. And before we dive in, I do want to give Tamron a shout out, a thank you for sponsoring the GreyLearning Webinar series, making this series possible so that we can have a series of free presentations available to photographers to hopefully help you improve your workflow and a wide variety of other aspects of your photography. If you hadn't had a chance to do so yet, be sure to check out Tamron's YouTube video, youtube.com/TamronVids. There's some really great videos there that I think you'll find interesting. And not just related to Tamron lenses, but just photography in general, giving you some creative insights, inspiration, etc. All right, so let's dive into talking about accessing our photos from anywhere. Along the way, if you have questions, so most of you should be connected via a web browser based on the way that we're presenting this webinar presentation. And so you should see a screen something like this. More to the point, you should see over on the right-hand side a little toolbar with that little conversation bubble with a question mark inside of it. And if you click that, it will expand that side panel so that down at the bottom there, as you'll see, you can type in a question and I will address as many of those along the way as I possibly can. All right, so let's talk about Lightroom. And we're going to start off talking about some of the confusion as it relates to Lightroom, because I know many of you might have been a little bit confused along the way through the history of Lightroom. Lightroom started off not being an ecosystem. It was essentially just Lightroom, or Adobe Photoshop Lightroom, but we just called it Lightroom. And that was an application, it still is essentially, just with a different name, but an application we use on our computer to manage our photos using a catalog to keep track of the information, the details about our photos, and then storing our photos on, for example, an external hard drive. And then, of course, being able to not only organize, but also optimize and share our photos in a variety of ways. And we were all hopefully doing mostly pretty well with that. I know having a catalog was a little bit of a new experience for many photographers, And so some photographers certainly got a little bit confused, I guess, about how Lightroom worked, or didn't understand how Lightroom worked before they dove in and started using Lightroom to manage their photos. And they created a little bit of a mess, but that's not the confusion I'm talking about right here. That would be when the new version of Lightroom came out, and that was called Lightroom, which means Adobe had to come up with a different name for Lightroom Classic, and Lightroom Classic is obviously the new name for what was just Lightroom. It's now called Lightroom Classic, and Lightroom, not to be confused with Lightroom Classic that used to be just Lightroom, is now what a lot of us refer to as the cloud version of Lightroom. And to be sure, the cloud essentially always existed on some level with Lightroom in terms of us being able to access the cloud to download updates to Lightroom. So for many of us, we got familiar with the cloud in the context of Adobe applications, primarily because we were not buying a DVD, for example. We were downloading software updates from the internet. And the cloud essentially is, for all intents and purposes, just a fancy way of saying a connection to the internet or to specific servers. So in this case, it would be the Adobe Creative Cloud servers, for example, via an internet connection. And so when Lightroom changed the landscape, as it were, and renamed Lightroom to Lightroom Classic and launched the new Lightroom, that created, needless to say, some confusion for many of us. Even listening to me talk about the history of that maybe leads to some confusion because it's hard to keep track of the changes and which version we're talking about. So for our purposes, if I only say Lightroom, assume that I'm mostly talking about Lightroom Classic or Lightroom as an overall ecosystem. When I talk about the newer version of Lightroom, that's going to be, in my reference anyway, Lightroom Cloud, and you're also going to hear me talk about a couple other versions of Lightroom that you may or not be familiar with. And so again, we have the cloud taking on a whole new meaning. It was, like I say, at one point just how we would download the latest updates to our software rather than, well, remember the days of going to the store and buying a CD or a DVD that you could install onto your computer. Now, for the most part, software, of course, sold online. We download, we install, and we're ready to roll right off the bat. But now that we have these two different versions of Lightroom, it, I think, helps in some ways to amplify the fact that Lightroom becomes an ecosystem now, or became an ecosystem once there were multiple versions. But I find a lot of photographers don't realize how much of that ecosystem really applies to them. It's not just Lightroom Classic. Fine, you're not going to be probably using what I call the cloud-based version of Lightroom if you are using Lightroom Classic, but you can use a couple of other versions, as it were, of Lightroom. So for many of us, as I mentioned, the cloud just means where we update via the internet. But for Lightroom Classic users, in addition to Lightroom Cloud users, there's a broader ecosystem. There are essentially additional versions of Lightroom that we can access and that enable us to share our photos from virtually anywhere, to access our photos, even to manage our photos and optimize our photos to a certain extent. So now we have the benefit of synchronization to the cloud, not just using the cloud to access the latest updates to our software, but actually being able to synchronize our data, essentially to synchronize our photos. And I think a good way to think about this, I know when we talk about the cloud and synchronization, a lot of photographers maybe start to feel a little intimidated or confused. But think about how you access email. Many of you, for example, might access your email in a web browser, and you also access your email on your phone. And you can also go on a trip and go to the business center in your hotel and sign in and access your email from there. Well, the Lightroom ecosystem gives us essentially that same capability to access our photos from virtually anywhere. So for our purposes, or at least I guess I should say for my purposes, and hopefully it was clear when you learned about this presentation that it was going to relate primarily to Lightroom Classic, for my purposes, home base, as it were, for my overall workflow is Lightroom Classic. And so that means that on my computer, I'm using Lightroom Classic to manage my photos. When I've captured new photos, I'm downloading them to my computer, in my case to an external hard drive, but I'm using Lightroom as the centerpiece of that process. So I'm, as part of that overall process, importing photos into my Lightroom catalog. And then, of course, going through a typical workflow, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and we'll talk about that a little bit in the context of this broader ecosystem. But in addition to having Lightroom Classic on my computer, I essentially have Lightroom available more or less constantly. No matter where I am or what I'm doing, I probably have access to some of my photos in Lightroom by virtue of carrying with me most of the time my smartphone. And I can actually use what I refer to as Lightroom Mobile, which is really just the mobile implementation of Adobe Lightroom. It is not referred to as Lightroom Classic because it's not limited to Lightroom Classic. You can use Lightroom Mobile whether you're using Lightroom Classic or the cloud version of Lightroom to manage your photos. So again, for our purposes today, I'm assuming Lightroom Classic as the foundation of that workflow. I'll talk about why I've made that decision in a little bit more detail shortly. But the point is that I can access, whether I'm using Lightroom Classic or Lightroom Cloud, I can access my photos on a mobile device using, again, what I refer to as Lightroom Mobile. It's really just Adobe Lightroom for your mobile devices, which, by the way, does include iPhones as well as Android devices, including the iPad, for example. So using a variety of different mobile devices, smartphones and tablets, you can access Lightroom. In addition, I gave that analogy of accessing your email from anywhere virtually, going to the hotel business center, for example, and using one of their shared computers in order to download your email, check your email, reply to emails, etc. Well, we can do the exact same thing essentially by accessing Lightroom through a web browser. And so for many of us, we can use Lightroom Classic as home base, of course, but then we can still access some of our photos from virtually anywhere. And that includes on mobile devices, that includes on virtually any computer that has an internet connection by using Lightroom in a web browser, for example. And of course, there are some details to address here, which I absolutely will address so that we understand how that workflow operates. But first, let's consider why, at least briefly, I'm using Lightroom Classic as the centerpiece of my overall workflow. And so I would say first and foremost that for me, Lightroom is about managing my workflow, but I'm a bit of a control freak and I want to manage my workflow my way. And the primary issue for me personally is that I want to control the storage. I want to manage my storage, my folders locally on my own hard drives, and Lightroom Classic enables me to do that. Whereas the cloud-based version of Lightroom, all of your photos are being synchronized to the cloud, and the basic idea is that with Lightroom, the cloud-based version, all of your photos, your primary storage can be thought of as being on the web. And you're just using the desktop application essentially to access your photos via an internet connection in much the same way you might check your email. It's not exactly the same by virtue of being able to essentially cache your photos locally as well. And so if you've used an email application, maybe Microsoft Outlook or the Mail app included with your operating system, then you'd be familiar with the notion of being able to see your emails. Whatever emails have already been downloaded, you can see even if you're not connected to the internet just by bringing up that application. You need an internet connection to get new email, for example, but you can still browse your email even when you're offline. And so Lightroom, the cloud-based version, gives you essentially much the same capability. I think it's a good analogy in any event. Obviously, there are some significant differences because of the way the workflow operates with, well, photos versus email, for example. But again, I think the analogy is helpful in understanding that with the cloud-based version of Lightroom, all of your photos can be thought of as first and foremost being stored on Adobe's servers, but copies are placed onto your computer. Copies can then be accessed via Lightroom on a mobile device, Lightroom in a web browser. The key difference in that regard is that 100% of your photos are being synchronized. Now, I don't know about you, but I have over 400,000 photos in my Lightroom Classic catalog. The notion of switching to Lightroom Cloud and having 400,000 of my photos synchronized so that I can then access 400,000 photos from my smartphone, that does not sound like a good feature to me personally. Now, one could certainly argue that I should pare down my catalog of photos, but I haven't done that, and I don't necessarily intend to do that. And so I'd rather have the option of, with Lightroom Classic, being able to synchronize only the photos I want. So photos that I want to have available everywhere, I choose to synchronize. And the rest of the photos that I've decided not to synchronize, they're stored on my local hard drives and they just are not available through these other outlets that I've been talking about. So let's take a look at some of the workflow considerations here, some sample workflows, some scenarios, and just to help you get a better understanding, number one, of how all of this Lightroom ecosystem works, but also, hopefully, I think, to inspire you to maybe make better use of this overall ecosystem, because there really are a variety of great benefits that are available there. So I'll talk about some of those various examples. I imagine that some of those at least will resonate with you. All right, and so I'm going to switch here to taking a look at Lightroom Classic. So I have some photos. I'm browsing, in this case, a folder of images. Note, by the way, this is not my normal catalog of 400,000 plus images. This is a demo catalog, which has about 4,000 images, a much more manageable number. But I have here a variety of different folders, photos that I'm organizing via folders within a Lightroom catalog using, of course, Lightroom Classic. And I might decide that some of these photos I would like to have available in a variety of different methods, basically in a variety of different contexts for sharing those images. And so the first thing to understand is how we actually choose to synchronize images to the Adobe Creative Cloud, to that cloud-based storage, that synchronization. And in Lightroom Classic, the way we synchronize photos is to, first of all, add those photos to a collection and then enable that collection for synchronization. Well, before we even get to that point, we need to actually make sure that synchronization in general is enabled. As I'm sure you're familiar at this point now with an Adobe Creative Cloud subscription, we're essentially signing in with our Adobe ID, our Creative Cloud account, so that we are online, assuming we have an internet connection. That enables us to download the latest updates. It also enables Adobe to make sure that you've continued, that you haven't canceled your subscription, for example. And so we have the internet connection in the background essentially as being a little bit of a tool to help us not only synchronize our photos, but also have Adobe check in on us. But now, with the recent update to Lightroom, the setting has changed a little bit. So first off, up at the top right of my screen, you'll see a little cloud icon. It happens to have a little check mark icon in a green circle there. But that is the newer way that we would access the synchronization feature, just in terms of the overall enabling of that feature. If you've not yet updated to the latest version of Lightroom, but you're still using a Creative Cloud subscription, then you would instead find that option on the identity plate. So up at the top left, by default, it just indicates that this is Lightroom. You can also change it, as I've done here, to put my name there. And if you click on that identity plate, that is where the setting for synchronization used to be. We still have the address lookup as well as face detection options there, but the cloud options, the synchronization options, have moved now over to this pop-up. So I can click that little cloud icon, And then I can see how much storage I've used. I've not used all that much of my available storage. I can see that locally everything has been synced, so there's no actual current synchronization activity. And if I need to, I could pause synchronization. Now, the synchronization doesn't really consume much in the way of overall resources. I say that now, but of course, here I'm broadcasting video and audio via an internet connection. So as I demonstrate some of the synchronization, some of that may be a little bit slow just by virtue of the fact that I'm using up part of my internet connection essentially for those other tasks. But if you felt that you wanted to make sure that Lightroom was not consuming any of your internet bandwidth, for example, obviously you could just quit Lightroom, but there's also the option to pause that synchronization here. So I could click to pause, and you'll see I get a little pop-up message. The status here changes to indicate that synchronization is paused. And of course, I can click again on that button in order to re-enable synchronization. So again, the first step is just to make sure that synchronization is actually enabled. And then we can create collections and enable synchronization. So let's just take a look at a quick example here. I'll collapse my folders section on the left panel here in the library module, and then we can go take a look at some of the collections here. And so, for example, here is a collection called Austria Stream, which includes some photos captured of a stream or river in Austria in the Alps. And I've added some photos to this particular collection. And once I have a collection, I can enable it for synchronization. And in this case, in this particular context, when I'm talking about a collection, I mean what you might refer to as a normal collection, not a smart collection. So the yellow gear icon here indicates that these are smart collections. And smart collections are essentially saved search results. And so those are not supported for synchronization, in part because you define settings, so criteria for these essentially saved search results. So favorites might be any image with a certain star rating or above, for example, or favorites with water might be above a certain star rating and has the keyword water. Well, as I change keywords and star ratings for photos, of course, the contents of this smart collection will change, and that essentially is just creating a fair bit of work in the background. So there's no real reason that Adobe could not enable us to synchronize smart collections, but we can't, at least for now. Maybe at some point we'll be able to. So it has to be a normal collection. And when you're creating a new collection, that just means choosing Create Collection rather than Create Smart Collection. I'll demonstrate that process here momentarily. But once you have a collection and you've perhaps added some images to that collection, then all we need to do is enable synchronization for the collections. Now, when I'm hovered over the collections list here, then you'll see over to the left of the collection names, one of two icons, either a little square icon that looks like an empty checkbox, or this little sort of double-headed arrow. It's almost kind of like a lightning bolt in my mind anyway. So the empty box means this collection is not enabled for synchronization. The little double-headed arrow indicates that this collection is indeed enabled for synchronization. And so you can see, for example, that we have this collection, Austria Stream, enabled for synchronization. And what that in turn means is that I can access my photos, any of the photos that are in a collection that has been synchronized. I can then access them simply by pulling up Lightroom on my mobile device, for example. And so here we take a look at Lightroom on my mobile device, and you can see I happen to be browsing the Austria Stream collection. So you can see the same collection that we were just looking at on my computer, essentially. In Lightroom Classic, the exact same photos, the exact same collection is available here. And so I can go look at, for example, the exact same photo on my mobile device, or, of course, on my computer. And as I mentioned, of course, we also have Lightroom in a web browser. And so when it comes to a web browser, I'll bring the web browser here into view, and we have, for example, that Austria Stream collection with the same photos. To access Lightroom Classic in a web browser, all you need to do is point your web browser to lightroom.adobe.com and then sign in with your Adobe Creative Cloud account, and you will have access to your photos, to the photos that you have enabled for synchronization. There's more that we can do. I'll demonstrate some of those additional items here momentarily, some of those additional workflow possibilities. But the point is that we are able to access our photos from essentially absolutely anywhere. Again, just the photos, though, that we have specifically chosen to synchronize. So let's take a look at the basic process involved in creating a new collection and synchronizing that collection, just so that we kind of round out this overall workflow. And so maybe I just want to have some photos available to share with others, to have on my device so that I can share them, maybe present a little slideshow on my smartphone, for example. There are a variety, of contexts, reasons that you might want to synchronize. But let's take a look then at creating a new collection. So on the left panel, in the Library module, I'll go to the Collections heading, and over to the right of that Collections heading, I will click that plus symbol, meaning I want to add a collection in this case. And when I click, I get the pop-up here, and I just want to create a new collection. Again, not a smart collection. I can create a collection set. That's basically just a container that can contain multiple collections. So as you start getting lots and lots of collections, then you might want to create collection sets to help consolidate those, to organize those a little bit better. But in this case, we'll just create a collection. So let's assume that I'm going to create a calendar next year, and I want to have the photos that I'm considering for my calendar available on my smartphone so that as I meet photographers, I can ask for their input if they think that such and such images are worthy of a calendar, for example. The point is that collections can be used for virtually any purpose, to just group photos together in a way that you choose. So grouping for a project, grouping to share, grouping for any purpose you can imagine, and specifically to have a set of photos that don't represent necessarily all of the photos in a folder, and that possibly include photos from multiple folders. And so it's just another way to organize our photos. When we add a photo to a collection, by the way, that does not create a copy of the original image file. So we're not using up extra storage space, for example. So I'm calling my collection Calendar. Well, I guess I could call this Calendar Photos just to be more thorough here. If I chose to put that collection into a collection set, I could, of course, turn on the checkbox and then select the collection set or create a new collection set. I could choose whether or not I want to include the selected photos in this collection. Well, no, actually I don't. Sometimes you do. Sometimes the reason you're creating a collection is that you found some photos and you want those photos, you want to select some photos and have them added to the collection that you're creating. So in this case, I didn't do that first. I certainly could have done that first, but since I didn't, I don't want the current selected photo to be added to the collection, so I'll simply turn that off. Now, if I am choosing to include the selected photos in the collection that I'm creating, there's also the option to make a new virtual copy. And so that just enables me to have the version of, as it were, of the photo in the collection be a separate interpretation from my master photo, from the original image. And you might, for example, let's say this calendar, I was going to make all of the images black and white. Then I might want to make virtual copies so that only the calendar versions of the photos are black and white. The original images are still going to be in color. So if you wanted a different interpretation then certainly you could take advantage of that virtual copy option here. Generally speaking, I don't use that feature because I generally want the images in the collection to match the original photos. Then we have the set as target collection option. So I'm creating a collection that's going to be empty. How am I going to add images to that collection? Well, one of the options is to set it as a target collection, which I will talk about momentarily. I'm going to go ahead and turn that option on. And then down below that, I also have the option to sync with Lightroom. Now remember, if we take a look over on the left side here in the collection section on the left panel in the library module, if I neglected to turn on this sync with Lightroom checkbox when I create my collection, I could always go turn on essentially that checkbox to the left of the collection name. And so whether I just didn't think I wanted to synchronize at the time, or I forgot, or I just neglected this checkbox, I can always turn that feature on, turn on that synchronization later on. So here, I'll go ahead and turn that on, but bear in mind, if I had not, I could just come over to the checkbox, essentially, the box over to the left of the name of the collection, and enable it or disable it at any time. So I'll go ahead and create that collection. And then I know we've got some questions here. So let's see if we can address some of these questions really quickly. So Georgianne's indicating she has 2 laptops. Which version of Lightroom should I use on the second computer? So assuming that you're choosing to use Lightroom Classic on your primary computer, you have essentially 2 options in my view. Number one is you could put your Lightroom catalog, your Lightroom Classic catalog, on an external hard drive and then transfer that external hard drive from one computer to the other. The other option is to use Lightroom Cloud on the second computer, recognizing that on that second computer you would only have access to photos that you had enabled for synchronization. You wouldn't have access to your entire catalog. So Lightroom Classic is really not designed to enable you to work across multiple computers easily with your catalog. It's only for the synchronization that we're talking about here today. If you really need to be able to work on multiple computers, you might consider using the cloud version of Lightroom. Personally, I don't consider that to be a great solution, but again, there are those other 2 options, including using the ability to work with your catalog on an external hard drive. Lightroom will be a little bit slower depending on your overall system configuration, but at least it gives you that flexibility. All right, so Roy indicates he's synchronizing a large number of images between Lightroom Classic and my iPad, Lightroom on the iPad. All are synchronized except for 7 that have not synchronized over months. So that can be a little bit of a challenge. There is in the options, so we can go into the preferences dialog and see the synchronization. And so if I pull up preferences here, for example, there is a Lightroom sync. So the preferences dialog is found on the on the Lightroom menu on the Macintosh version, or on the edit menu on the Windows version. And if there's errors, they should be shown under sync activity. And if so, you could click in order to see where that photo is. In some cases, turning off synchronization and turning it back on, or turning off synchronization either overall or in general, if you can identify which collection is at issue there, turning that synchronization for that collection off, waiting for that to update, and then turning it back on again. There are a variety of scenarios where the synchronization does become a little bit problematic. And yeah, Michael, can you sync photos from the iPhone or from your smartphone to Classic? We will talk about that a little bit later. And let's see. Just looking at the other questions here. And so good question. Karen's asking, are you actually accessing the photo or a smart preview? In this context, that would be a smart preview on your other devices. And then to Alan's question, we sort of talked about this earlier, but again, just as a reminder, if you want to enable or disable that synchronization, then we would use that button over to the left. I consider it basically a checkbox, except when you turn it on, it doesn't get a check mark. It gets that sort of lightning bolt symbol. All right, so we'll come back to some of the other questions here a little bit later, but let's go ahead and forge ahead into some of these additional areas of working with a collection. So I have that calendar photos collection that we just created. Notice that on the left side of that collection, we have that little lightning bolt, that synchronization symbol indicating that synchronization is enabled. So all of the no photos that are in this collection are being synchronized to the cloud, but I can now add photos to that collection. And so let's assume, for example, that I want to go find an image that I would like to include in my calendar. I can go find a particular photo and then simply drag and drop. So I have on the film strip a photo selected, and then I have my calendar photos collection. I can simply drag and drop. But it gets much easier than that because we can also add with a quick keyboard shortcut. So let's see. Oh, here's this adorable dog. Which one of these? Oh, these are maybe copies. Oh, that's an edited version. So here is a cute dog photo, or at least an interesting dog photo, and I would like to add this to the collection for the calendar. Well, remember that I set this collection, the calendar photos collection, as the target collection. And that's why you see a plus symbol over to the right of the name of that collection. That is the target collection. The plus indicates that that is the target collection. What you might not have realized is that the default target collection is actually the quick collection that you'll find up at the top of the left panel in the catalog section. You see the quick collection, which normally has a plus to the right of it, at least by default. Now it does not, because I have created a new collection and identified it as the target. Now I could go choose a different collection, so I could right-click on a different collection and set that as the target collection by, of course, choosing Set as Target Collection. But the key is that when we have a target collection, we can add images to that collection by simply using a keyboard shortcut that you might be familiar with as the keyboard shortcut for the quick collection. But it's not actually the quick collection keyboard shortcut. It is the target collection keyboard shortcut. It's just that by default, the quick collection is the target collection. So the keyboard shortcut happens to be the letter B, as in boy. I don't know what it stands for otherwise, but the letter B on the keyboard will add the current selected image to the quick collection. To the target collection, which by default is the quick collection, but at the moment is actually the calendar photos collection. So I'll go select another photo and press the letter B, and maybe I would go find additional images elsewhere that I would like to add to that particular collection. And when I do, then I can, of course, just press that letter B on the keyboard in order to add that image. So maybe a tree with a starburst, I'll press the letter B. And if we go back to that collection, you'll see that the images that I've used that keyboard shortcut with in this case are being added to this collection. Well, what you might also notice is that each of these images now has that familiar synchronization symbol at the top right of the thumbnail, indicating that the image is at least in a collection intended for synchronization. If we take a look at the image, the second image here, notice there's a little ellipsis down below the synchronization symbol for that image. That will soon, or at least reasonably soon, disappear. Up at the top right, you'll see that instead of that green circle with a check mark, we now have the sync symbol. The activity symbol sort of looks like the recycle symbol, the two arrows forming a circle, and that indicates that synchronization is currently in progress and not finished. And so this particular image is not yet, as I was speaking there, it finished synchronizing, and so the ellipsis disappeared. And so that's one other way that we can see an indication of which images are actually synchronized to the Creative Cloud. And then, of course, with the images in a collection that has synchronization enabled, and then we naturally can go to our other devices, and so I can go look at my other devices. And so I'll go ahead now and enable screen mirroring and bring up my smartphone here, and you'll see that I have that calendar photos collection, and the photos have indeed synchronized. Notice, by the way, these star ratings are shown here. We'll talk more about those star ratings momentarily. All right, well, at least the ability to synchronize, more importantly. So obviously they did synchronize. The star ratings synchronized by virtue of the star ratings that you see here are appearing. In this case, I showed Lightroom Mobile. The same would be true of Lightroom in my web browser. And so we're getting that metadata. Not everything. We'll talk about the details there momentarily. But we're at least getting most of the metadata for our images in terms of being able to view it as well as update some of it. All right, one of the other considerations here, if you travel, I know most of us, myself certainly included, are not doing a lot of travel these days, but hopefully things will get back to normal soon and we'll be able to travel to wonderful destinations for photography again. But one of the great benefits of using this Lightroom ecosystem is the ability to review your photos on a, for example, mobile device. And so on an airplane, for example, using a laptop, not always the easiest thing in the world. We often don't have a whole lot of space available for that laptop, and so you might want to use a tablet or even a smartphone for that review purpose if you're on an airplane. So let's take a look at an example of that, and do bear in mind that in this case I'm going to synchronize a set of photos, a larger set of photos. It will take more time, and so things won't update as quickly since I'm also using up a lot of my bandwidth for this live streaming presentation. But I'm going to import. So the idea here is that I'm on a trip and I want to import some photos and then make them available on a mobile device or in my web browser. So I'll click the import button down at the bottom of the left panel in the library module, and then I can select the source. So in this case, Lightroom recognized that I had a media card in a card reader, for example, and so it brings that up as the default source. I want to, at the top center, choose to copy those photos, and I'm going to copy them actually to the external hard drive in this case, and these photos are essentially Mediterranean. I'm going to just type Med Photos. I'm going to create a new subfolder called Med Photos. So I'm copying to my external hard drive, and I'm just making a folder to contain those images. Now, I'm not going to talk about all of the various options that are available for importing our photos, because that would take a lot of time, and it's not super critical in terms of what we're talking about here today. But bear in mind that, of course, I could add keywords to these photos. I could apply a develop preset to these images. I am applying a metadata preset. I can rename the images, etc. But treat this as a normal import. So whatever you would normally do, and I'm not even going to worry about reviewing to make sure that I've got all those settings as I normally would. Instead, I want to focus on the synchronization aspect here. Notice that in the file handling section of the right panel in the import dialog, down at the bottom we have an add to collection checkbox. And so I can turn that checkbox on and then choose one of my collections. So here, for example, is that calendar photos collection that I had just created, and the Austria stream collection that we were browsing earlier. And I can also create a new collection. So I'm going to click the plus symbol over to the right of that Add to Collection checkbox to make a brand new collection, and we'll just call this Med Review. And I will not make it the target collection, but I am going to enable synchronization. So I'll go ahead and create that new collection. Again, I'm adding every single photo that I'm importing to this collection. That will be clear as to what the benefit there is momentarily. And so I'm going to go ahead and import these photos with the key feature that we want to keep in mind right now being that we are adding these photos to a collection, and that collection has synchronization enabled. So I'll go ahead and click import. Naturally, this process can take a little bit of time here, so I'm copying these photos to the external hard drive into a particular folder. Previews are being built, metadata might be getting updated. There's a variety of tasks that are being performed essentially all more or less automatically, you might say, as part of that overall import process. And as part of that process, of course, we are also adding these images to a collection that has synchronization enabled, or at least will once this process is completed. And so now, if we go back to that Med Photos collection, that's the Med Photos folder. If we go back down into collections, it was the Med Review collection. Over to the left, you'll see that synchronization symbol. So we know that this collection has synchronization enabled and that the photos then will be synchronized to the cloud. You can see, once again, up at the top right, that symbol on the cloud indicating that the synchronization is active, and the ellipsis at the top right of the thumbnails that indicates, along with that synchronization symbol, that those images have not yet been synchronized, that they haven't made it up to the cloud, which also means, of course, that they haven't made it back down to my web browser, for example, or to my smartphone with the Lightroom mobile app, for example. And so I need to be patient. Oh, and I can see that the ellipsis symbols are starting to disappear. And so I know that at least some of those photos are available. And so if I once again bring up my smartphone here, so I'll go ahead and bring up the Lightroom mobile application, and we can see that there are once again the collections of images over on the left, including that Med Review collection that represents all of the photos that I imported and that I then added to, as part of that import process, a collection with synchronization enabled. And so those photos are now, ultimately, of course, we would have to double check whether or not all of the images made it. So I'll go back. Yes, it was 15 images. And so you can see that all 15 images, it looks like, have made it to my mobile device. And so I can swipe through and see that the images have indeed arrived. And so we've demonstrated a variety of different ways that we've essentially gotten photos into the Lightroom ecosystem, up to the Adobe Creative Cloud, and in this particular example, onto my, in this case, smartphone. And this is just one example of the various workflow possibilities. But here, for example, I mentioned, flying back home after a trip, I downloaded my photos along the way. I added them to a collection with synchronization enabled. I waited patiently until all the photos had synchronized. And now, even if I'm offline, I still have access to these photos. You'll have to trust me on that. I can't simulate going offline when I'm broadcasting live, but we can go through that process. So now I can review my images. Now at the moment, if you take a look at the top left, you'll see that I am in the edit mode, and that's why over on the right-hand side we see the various controls that represent essentially the develop module. But I can also switch into, for example, the rate and review. And so I can review my images. I can swipe left and right to navigate through the various images that I have synchronized, and I can rate those images. You might have noticed, by the way, that keywording was one of those options. More on that in a moment. That's not something that we're going to be able to take advantage of, unfortunately. But the point is that now we can perform that review. So whether you're using this workflow so that you can just sit back in your easy chair and review your photos in a more comfortable setting, or because you're flying home from a trip and you want to review the photos along the way, now we can use that time efficiently on a small device rather than a larger computer, for example, from virtually anywhere to review our photos. And so you'll see down at the bottom when I'm in my review option here that I have the star rating and the pick or reject flags. I only use star ratings. I don't use the pick flags, for example. Sometimes I'll use the reject flag to mark photos for deletion, but the pick and reject flag features are only available inside of Lightroom, so they don't get saved out to metadata for your photos, for example, whereas star ratings are. And so I prefer to use star ratings. If I wanted to give an image a star rating, I can use the left side of the screen. If I want a pick or reject flag, I can use the right side of the screen. So let's assume this image I'm not necessarily super happy with. I swipe over to the next image, and maybe this one I like more. Over on the left side of the image, I can tap and drag upward to increase the star rating and drag downward to decrease the star rating. So my typical workflow involves using a single star rating for my initial review as to whether this is a keeper or maybe not so much of a keeper image. So I would just assign a star rating. Maybe I could use this for the beginning of a slideshow about Saint-Tropez. And I love windows in general. It's just kind of a general overview shot, so I'll skip by that one. And let's see, we've got a couple of similar images. I kind of like the one with the light post there, so I'll give that a star rating as well. And again, just going through and reviewing the images. If they're similars, just swiping back and forth and deciding which ones seem to be the better of the images and assigning star ratings along the way. And of course, that gives me the ability to work in a very efficient and comfortable way with my images, but naturally, I suppose it goes without saying that information will also synchronize. And lucky for me, in the background, while I was working on my smartphone to assign some star ratings, you can see that the images, in fact, I'll switch to the grid view display so that you can see within the thumbnails here that we have star ratings that are applied to those images, the images that I selected. So you'll see them on the film strip as well as in the grid view display for those images. So I mentioned keywords. That is a limitation. So if you're using the cloud-based version of Lightroom, your keywords will synchronize across everything. If you're using Lightroom Classic, unfortunately that's not the case because Lightroom Classic supports hierarchical keywords, and so we don't have, and that support is not available in Lightroom, the cloud-based version, nor is it available in Lightroom Mobile, and so the keywording does not synchronize across all of those different features. However, we do have the ability to update some metadata, and so, for example, if I wanted to add some metadata, I will bring back my mobile device here. And if I go into the info option, so tapping up at the top left where we have the edit for optimizing the image for applying adjustments, rating and reviews, you saw with the star ratings, keywords that we ignore. But under info, we do have certain fields available. And so, for example, I could update the title. And so, I won't type a long title here. I think if I remember correctly, this was Crete. I guess I should put a capital letter on that. So bear with me if this is absolutely incorrect, but I think it was Crete in Greece, but I might be wrong, but we'll just assume I'm correct at the moment. I can add that title, or notice right down below there the caption, and that information will synchronize. And so if I go select that image and wait patiently for the title or caption to synchronize via the Creative Cloud, then over here on the right panel, we'll see that information. So if everything goes smoothly as I'm waiting for that update, then we'll see the text pop up, hopefully, as if by magic. So we do have some degree of ability to synchronize metadata, but unfortunately not keywords in this context. And as I mentioned, the edit option there, we can go through, and the same is available on our smartphones or tablets using the Lightroom mobile application, as well as, I'll bring back my web browser here, we also have the adjustments available for our images in the web browser. And so we can synchronize adjustments across our various devices as well. And so if I made various changes to the appearance of the image here, for example, if I were to, well, maybe I should make something more dramatic. I'll switch this to black and white just so that it's something a bit more dramatic, essentially. And so we see that in my web browser here, the thumbnail will update for that image. And then once that synchronization has completed, so if I go back to that Austria stream, at some point here we should also see, not should, we will see, if I wait around for it, I kind of skipped past, there we go, the change to black and white. I skipped past waiting for that title to show up, but since the image here just updated, I am sure, there we go, there is our title, sure enough. So again, the key being understanding that this information is synchronizing across our various devices. And that includes adjustments as well as our star ratings and some of the other metadata. And then in a very simple way, you might say, so I'll switch back, for example, to another collection of images, and I will bring up, not the web browser, but my smartphone, and we can share our images in a variety of ways as well. So browsing one of my collections, and I can tap the ellipsis up at the top right, and then tap slideshow. There are the images included. I tap play up at the top right, and I get a little slideshow of those images. So for sharing purposes as well. And then I also want to talk briefly about going in the other direction. And so you might notice at the bottom right of my screen here that I have a little camera icon. So there was a question earlier about how do I get my photos from my mobile device if I want to capture images. And there are ways that we could, for example, use the built-in camera app on your smartphone and then import those photos into Lightroom Classic. But I would say one of the easiest ways to get your photos from your smartphone, for example, to your normal workflow in Lightroom Classic is to use the smartphone as a camera naturally, but not the built-in camera app, but rather the Lightroom mobile app. Use that to capture your images. So now we're really going to test things here and make sure that everything works smoothly as we're kind of breaking the boundaries here of what I normally would want to do for a live demo, hoping nothing goes wrong. But down at the bottom right, I'll tap that camera icon. I'm just going to take essentially a blank picture here. So I will tap the shutter button. Notice, well, you might notice that I'm in the Pro setting. I'm actually capturing, if you look, in this case, it appears up at the top center. That would normally be the left side of the screen, of course, but I can take a picture and that happens to be in the Adobe DNG format. So I'm taking a blank picture of the desktop. The flash was set to auto, so that fired. And so I have that image now captured in the Lightroom mobile app on my mobile device. And what that means is that then if I go to Lightroom Classic on the computer, that I will find my device represented as though it were a hard drive, essentially. So you'll see Tim Gray's iPhone here, as though if we scroll up, we can see the My Photos hard drive here momentarily, and the Macintosh hard drive, the internal hard drive on my computer. But we also have my smartphone behaving as though it were essentially a hard drive. It is a storage device, and within that you'll see that there's an imported photos folder, and once again, if we allow for enough time, then we will find that the image that I just captured, that well, maybe not the most creative image I've ever captured, but that image nevertheless will synchronize via the Creative Cloud. And so then I will have, here it is appearing, that amazing photo. Prints will be available for sale at the end of this webinar. But we have the image automatically synchronizing. And perhaps more importantly, let's pretend that this was an image captured during that same Mediterranean trip where I put the images into the Med Photos, in this case, folder on the hard drive. I could also then drag and drop. So I don't want this to be sort of on my phone, for example. I can put it into my normal storage. I can simply drag and drop and go put that into whichever folder I'd like, but in this case, Med Photos. So I can confirm and move that on my hard drive, and we'll see that the actual photo then is in my normal storage management, you might say. And then lastly, I know there's a lot of questions. I probably won't be able to get anywhere near to all of them, but I'll get to as many of those as I can. But we also have one other option that is available for synchronizing these images. If you go to the collection, a synchronized collection, well, really, we can do this with any of these collections ultimately, but in this case, one of the collections that I would like to make available through other means, in the grid view, when you're browsing a collection, up at the top right, you'll find a Make Public link. And if you click that link, then Lightroom Classic will generate a URL, a website address. And once that is generated here, those photos will then be made available as a public gallery. And so once that URL eventually appears, I could share that URL with anyone else that I would like to share the images with, and they'd be able to go browse. So there's the link, which I could click in order to follow into the web browser here, and you'll see that there's that calendar photos collection for what it's worth, and the set of photos that I had enabled for synchronization within that particular collection. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground, but the key thing to keep in mind is that we can access our photos from anywhere in a variety of ways using Lightroom Classic as the focal point, as it were, of our workflow, but then being able to see the images that we have synchronized via collections on our mobile device or in our web browser as well. Again, the web browser, going to lightroom.adobe.com and signing in. So first off, I want to thank you all for joining me today. I know that was a lot of information, but I've heard so many photographers asking about the synchronization features. I wanted to cover that in a GreyLearning webinar presentation. And so if you've got questions, I know that we've got some that have accumulated here, and I'll take a look at those and get to as many of those as I possibly can. And actually, a really good question, which I kind of just skimmed over, you might say. Janie asks, how did you get into editing on the smartphone? Oh, I guess you were asking specifically about editing. So bear in mind that the Lightroom app is available in the Google Play Store or the iTunes Store. And it's that pop-up that we had up at the top left where we've got the edit features. And if you're not seeing that, you might make sure that you've got, well, it's not been changed. It's been a while since that was updated, but in any event, make sure you're working with the latest version of the app on your device. And so Ron's asking about the phone camera shows JPEG. So if you're in the camera feature with the Lightroom mobile app, so that you're able to then capture new photos, then you'll see a Pro option, and you can choose Pro versus automatic, professional versus automatic. So if you click there, and so in fact I can bring this up briefly. There we go. And just have to switch. So let me pull this away and switch. And so you'll see, again, this is going sideways just because it doesn't automatically rotate here when it necessarily should when we're sharing in this way. But down by the shutter release button, that Pro button, you can tap to pop that up and switch between automatic mode versus professional. And then in professional mode, you can switch between DNG. So by tapping on DNG versus JPEG, well, tapping on DNG as it is in this case, you can switch that capture option between DNG and the JPEG capture option. All right. Looking at the questions here. And so Jim's asking, is there a limit to how many images Lightroom will sync to the cloud? Well, there's not a limit per se, other than you have the ability to synchronize up to a certain amount of data. And so you might have noticed my pop-up showed that I had a terabyte of storage capacity available. So it depends on your Creative Cloud plan, and that determines. Now keep in mind, we're synchronizing smart previews, and so that is not it's not requiring as much storage space typically as a raw capture, and so it can be a little bit tricky to sort of estimate how many photos you might be able to store, but it's based on the size. You can certainly monitor that, and of course you could disable synchronization for some of your collections if you started running low on space, or Adobe offers the convenient option of upgrading your storage, and that there's a variety of different prices and it varies by region, but you can add additional storage capacity. And so it does again vary by plan in terms of how much storage capacity you have, but you can upgrade that up to certain limits. And good question, Charles. A good suggestion, I guess I should say. So Charles asked if I will teach a webinar on the Lightroom mobile camera. So there are actually quite a variety of features on that camera app. So I will indeed. I'll add that to the list. I'll be curious to see what the interest level will be on that. I'm curious to know how many photographers are interested in making use of that. So yeah, we'll definitely make a point of doing that in the near future. And so Susan, you were making folders on your iPad that actually would be albums, or in the context of Lightroom Classic would be collections. And no, that's not a problem at all. And let's see, Alan asked if I think keyword synchronization might be a future feature. Anything is possible, but my guess would be probably not, simply because, quite frankly, hierarchical keywords are a messy feature. They're not actually properly supported by any of the metadata standards, and so instead, software is just using basically the well, now I just lost my train of thought, actually. So, the hierarchical keywords, sorry. And so, so I'm looking at questions and got myself distracted. But hierarchical keywords aren't properly supported by other software. They're supported, but through their own custom approach. So you'll see different symbols, a pipe symbol or a colon or a bracket symbol used to indicate that keywords are hierarchical, that they have that relationship. The Lightroom cloud-based version does not support hierarchical keywords. In order for the synchronization for keywords to be a possibility, either they would have to discontinue support in Lightroom Classic, which would create all sorts of a mess, or they would have to add support to Lightroom, the cloud-based version, and I sort of feel like that might not be very high on their priority list, in part because it can be such a confusing setup in terms of supporting across a wide variety of different platforms. So Dave's asking, so again, yeah, I don't think that will happen, but hey, I'd love to be wrong about that so that we can actually synchronize our keywords across Lightroom Classic to all of these other platforms, as it were, the other elements of that ecosystem. Dave's asking how to turn off the plus symbol next to the target collection. You don't exactly turn it off, but rather you would choose a different collection to be the target collection. My recommendation, if you're using that feature, which obviously, as we saw, can be very, very helpful, then having the collection that you're currently working with as a target collection means you can just use a keyboard shortcut, that letter B on the keyboard. But when you're finished with that, I recommend resetting the target collection to the quick collection so that that gives you that sort of default behavior, so that if you hit the letter B on the keyboard, it's not going to some random collection, so to speak. Granted, you could just scroll through and find the plus symbol, but it would then be added to the quick collection. So I recommend resetting that when you're sort of finished working with a collection as the target collection. To change it, you simply right-click on the desired collection and choose to set that as the target collection. And so I would typically reset the quick collection to once again be the target collection once I'm finished working with once I'm finished adding photos to the other collection. All right. So John's question, are full resolution files sent to the Creative Cloud? In the context of Lightroom Classic, no, those are smart previews. And I forget the specific number, but it is in the general vicinity. It's kind of an odd number, so to speak, but it's in the general vicinity of 2,500 pixels across. And so that I guess for most of us at least, if this file is smaller, it won't be enlarged, of course, but for higher resolution images, they would be downsized as what are essentially DNG images as smart previews at 2,500 and change pixels on the long side. All right. And so, yeah, Richard's asking if the photo's available on your phone offline, it must have made a copy. Yes, sort of, but it's not making a copy of your master image. It's making a reference to the image as that smart preview that we were talking about. And yeah, so Alan, sort of a related question, if you're shooting RAW, are those updated as opposed to JPEGs? They would actually be smart previews, which are DNG images, which gives you much better quality than compared to a JPEG image. And see, Jack's asking, seems like making collection on import, then doing any edits never gets these changes into the main library of the photos. So that would suggest that synchronization maybe is just not enabled on one side or the other. Even though I'm using considerable bandwidth just to present this live presentation, of course, you could see that those various updates are synchronizing. So there may be something else at play. You might want to make sure that you're signed in, that synchronization is enabled, etc. But they can sometimes take a little bit of time depending on your connection. Let's see. So great question, Charles. When you delete photos on the various devices, depends on which device. And so if you're deleting from the mobile device or on the web browser, remember that represents a collection, so you're only removing the image from the collection. This is different on the cloud-based version of Lightroom, by the way, so treat that as being a completely different scenario in this case. But for Lightroom Classic, that does not delete your original master image. It's removing from the collection. And then Michael's asking, if you take photos on the iPhone with the camera app, same would hold true for Android, not with the Lightroom camera app, how would you synchronize? You could import, so next to the camera icon, there was the photos icon, and you could import from your camera roll, for example, to Lightroom and then have that automatic synchronization that way. That can start to get a little bit messy. Well, frankly, using the camera app gets a little messy anyway. My personal approach in that case would be to download the photos to your computer and then import them. Basically, treat your smartphone as though it were just a camera, except a camera where, in the case of iPhone users anyway, we're not able to take the media card out of the camera. So we've got to plug in the phone, the smartphone, the iPhone, to the computer and download, or of course you could use other methods to download. But you could use, for example, Adobe Bridge to download the photos and delete them from your smartphone. Now you have them, for example, in a folder on your desktop, and you could then import those into Lightroom Classic, copying them as part of that process over to your external hard drive. It can feel a little bit clunky, to be sure, but the main issue there is just not being able to take a media card out of the camera, in the case of an iPhone, download and import directly, and then reformat that card. And so you want to use software that enables you to delete the photos from your smartphone. Well, at least in my opinion, you want to do this so that you don't have all these photos taking up space on your smartphone and creating confusion. Instead, you're treating your smartphone like a normal camera. You're just downloading from your smartphone, treating it as a camera, importing into Lightroom Classic and getting onto your external hard drive. And then, of course, not having those photos, just as you wouldn't generally want to leave photos on a media card that you put back into the camera with the photos still there, you'd want to reformat the card at that point. Same basic concept in terms of using a smartphone. So I find that to make the most sense just because I treat my smartphone as a computer. As a camera. I'm treating my smartphone as just another camera that I'll take pictures, download, get them into my computer, and then remove, essentially. And Ron's asking, I mentioned the notion of putting the Lightroom Classic catalog on an external hard drive rather than the internal hard drive that is by default. You would just want to figure out where the folder is that contains the catalog. You can go into catalog settings within Lightroom Classic and get that location information. There's even a button there where you can click to open up the folder that contains your catalog folder. And then when you have identified the folder that contains your catalog along with all of the various other support files, then you can quit Lightroom to make sure Lightroom's not actually running. And then what I recommend is to copy that entire folder to the external hard drive. Once it's made it there successfully, rename the folder on your internal hard drive so that you save it as a backup. I would generally just put the word backup at the beginning of the folder name for that folder that contains the catalog. And then you can simply go to the external hard drive and open up the folder that contains the catalog and double click on the LRCat file. That's the Lightroom catalog file, and that will cause the catalog to be opened and Lightroom, of course, launched as part of that process. As I mentioned, though, do keep in mind that when you're working with your catalog on an external hard drive, performance will typically be a bit slower. It depends, of course. If you've got a very fast external hard drive, it'll work out nicely, but it can slow things down a bit. And then Ted's asking if Lightroom Mobile is the same as Lightroom Cloud. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, these are sort of my nicknames, you might say, for these various implementations of Lightroom. And so we can go to lightroom.adobe.com in a web browser, and I just refer to that as Lightroom Web. Lightroom Classic is, of course, the application running on my computer. Lightroom Cloud is the term I use to describe Lightroom, Adobe Lightroom, the cloud-based version, that newer version of Lightroom that is not Classic. And then Lightroom Mobile is really just Adobe Lightroom. It is the version that runs on mobile devices. And so in that context, no, they're not the same. But again, just keep in mind that I'm using sort of nicknames there for those different implementations of Lightroom as part of the overall Lightroom ecosystem. All right, we've run a bit over time, but I did want to try to get to as many of those questions as possible. And so we'll wrap it up there. Thank you again so much for joining me for this presentation today. I hope that's very helpful. I will try to follow up on as many of those questions as possible, perhaps include them in the Ask Tim Gray email newsletter in coming days and weeks, for example. And I will put together a presentation. That was a great suggestion on specifically the camera features of the Lightroom mobile app. And so stay tuned for that. Thank you so much for joining me for this presentation as part of the GreyLearning Webinar series. Thank you to Tamron for sponsoring this series. And yes, indeed, as always, the sessions are recorded. So if you're registered for the webinar, you'll get a follow-up email with information on how to access that recording. I know I've covered a lot of material. We moved rather quickly, and so you may want to go back and review that. You'll get an email follow-up with the details for accessing that. So thank you again so very much for joining me, and I'll hope to see you all in a future presentation as part of the GreyLearning Webinar series. Thanks very much.